Thomas Jefferson was worried. As the ambassador of the country he had helped found, Jefferson was in France to negotiate trade agreements with all of Europe and talk up the wonders of the newly freed republic he represented. But there was revolution afoot in the streets of the French capital, and Jefferson, ensconced in a beautiful home on the Champs-Élysées near the Rue de Paris, had just received a shipment of the finest Bordeaux from the Margaux region of France. Knowing he would have to temporarily leave as things got worse, he went into his cellar, marked the bottles in the shipment carefully with his initials, and then walled them up behind bricks so they would neither be stolen nor drunk in the coming weeks and months of rebellion. Then he left the country that he had come to love for its art and its architecture, its culture and its soul, and for its shockingly superior wine. He would return, he figured, but he didn't. He became Secretary of State, then President, and, he got busy. So he had the belongings and books that were stashed in France packed up by others and returned to Monticello. As anyone who has ever moved knows, a few things may have been left behind. Hardy Rodenstock could barely contain his excitement as he shared this story with wine collectors in the 1980s with the find of a lifetime. See, he explained, almost 200 years later, a Parisian contractor opened up a brick wall during a reconstruction project. Finding the carefully hidden bottles undisturbed, the contractor called a German wine dealer he had heard of and mentioned the find. That German wine dealer was Rodenstock himself, and he knew what the contractor did not. If this cache of 18th century wine from the highly regarded Margaux, Mouton, and Chateau d'Yquem vineyards were what he claimed they were a gold mine. When he found out they'd been personally initialed by Thomas Jefferson, they'd be almost priceless. Almost. Because Rodenstock knew there were people out there willing to pay dearly for them. For one thing, 18th century wines were a rarity. For another, so was anything directly linked to Jefferson. This would change the wine market forever. If he could convince that market that they were authentic. What followed would shake the world of luxury collectibles to its core. Before it was over, billionaires would spend millions chasing authenticity, scientists would fire atomic particles at wine bottles, and an entire industry would be forced to confront uncomfortable questions about expertise, trust, and the true nature of value. In the rarefied world of ultra-expensive collectibles, the difference between priceless artifact and worthless fake sometimes comes down to who you choose to believe. Only Hardy Rodenstock knew the real truth about those bottles from the beginning. I'm Amber Hunt, and this is Crimes of the Centuries. It was raining that Thursday afternoon in late 1985, but it was London, so that was expected. Everything else about that day would not be, because the oldest and most revered auction house in Great Britain was about to auction off Lot 137, the oldest authenticated vintage red wine to ever come up for sale. The auction catalog had been written by Michael Broadbent, the man who, as Benjamin Wallace wrote in The Billionaire's Vinegar, had, quote, largely invented and come to dominate the global market in old and rare wines, end quote. Here's how French wine expert Etienne Pommier described Broadbent in his podcast, Wine Stories.
Michael Broadbent is 58 years old. He is the founder of Christie's wine department and one of the first to hold the prestigious Master of Wine title. For 20 years, he has been searching through the cold and damp cellars of Scottish castles and Britain's oldest mansions to find the bottles that have allowed Christie's to claim the leadership on the fine wine auction market, grossing £7.3 million in sales in 1984.
Benjamin Wallace, who chronicled the complicated world this bottle inhabited, likewise characterized Broadbent's palate as the most experienced in the world. The bottle in question was fashioned of dark green hand-blown glass. A seal of black wax covered the cap. There was no label affixed to it, only the etched word Lafitte and some initials. Broadbent's words in the catalog were vague, but cunningly so. Lot 137 was a bottle of 1787 Lafitte engraved with the initials capital T, lowercase h, period, capital J, no spaces between. Broadbent then added, for emphasis, Th.J. are the initials of Thomas Jefferson. Evidence suggested that the bottle's previous owner was the great man, and the implication was clear. Broadbent believed what he had been told by Hardy Rodenstock, the man who had consigned him the bottle, that, yes, these were in Jefferson's possession in 1787, and he had intended to partake of this very bottle, but alas, history had prevented it. There was plenty to bolster the claim. Jefferson had been in France at the appropriate time. When he returned to the United States, he continued to have French wine shipped to him, and, on one occasion at least, to his friend George Washington. In that last instance, Jefferson had asked that the cases be appropriately marked with the initials of the two men separately, so that they knew which cases were to go where. Jefferson was a bit of a wine snob. The New Yorker magazine, in 2007, referred to him as, quote, America's first wine connoisseur, end quote. Writer Patrick Radden Keefe also, in his own little aside, noted that he might have also been America's first great wine bore. Referring to an 1807 Jefferson hosted dinner that he had attended, John Quincy Adams confided in his diary, quote, there was, as usual, a dissertation upon wines, not very edifying, end quote. Sorry, I found that funny. Anyway, Broadbent had done some due diligence. His reputation was too important to him not to. He had asked Christie's expert in 18th century glass if the bottle was authentic to the age. It was. He asked another Christie's expert if the engravings had been in the French style. They were. He had even tasted the wine from a Jefferson bottle that had been opened by Rodenstock at a large gathering of wine aficionados in Wiesbaden a few months prior. Surprisingly, given how wines can age into what is derisively known to wine experts as salad dressing, the wine inside these bottles had held its character. Broadbent had written of Jefferson's 1784 Chateau d'Yquem, an extremely high-end sweet white wine. When it was poured into his glass, quote, the nose was perfect, gentle, scented vanilla, no oxidation, not a trace of acidification, no faults. After 20 minutes, the remains in the glass had an indescribable fragrance. On the palate, the wine was still sweet, with perfect body and balance, flavor of ripe peaches and creams, excellent acidity, and dry finish, end quote. He was sold on it hook, line, and pedigree. But there were already rumblings. Rodenstock had reached out 2 months prior to the big auction, in October 1985, to a consortium of Virginia wine growers to inform them of his find. Perhaps he thought them rich and dumb. They were not dumb. The Vinifera Wine Growers Association issued a press release early on, essentially alerting the American audience to the discovery, but expressing grave concerns about its authenticity. Not only did the newsletter report that they wanted answers to the question of where and how the bottles were found, but they'd already checked with the definitive source on all things Thomas Jefferson, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello, to see if they were aware of them. They weren't. Let's pause for a brief moment to let me explain that I know diddly about wine, except that I like to drink it. In researching this episode, I learned a lot, but not so much that I'm going to be throwing around words that I barely understand about wine I never had the pleasure to drink. So, this will be an episode about a crime that took place in the rarefied air of those who can afford to spend thousands of dollars on a single bottle of squash grapes. No offense. Again, I'm a big fan of squash grapes. I know a little more about Jefferson, enough to know that he's been studied and documented and gone over with a fine-tooth comb since the day he penned the Declaration of Independence. And the people at Monticello are not some pikers. I'll leave it at that. Now back to Broadbent and the much-anticipated late December 1985 auction. He was understandably nervous, and this was his reputation. This was his auction house. This was his moment. And he was disappointed, as he had expected to get the imprimatur of Monticello, but had fallen short. While it was true that when Jefferson's boxed-up Parisian belongings got to Monticello in late 1789, he noted he was one box short of his expected wine cellar stash, historian Cinder Goodwin had dashed Broadbent's hopes. Goodwin was the preeminent scholar in all things contained in Jefferson's papers, and that man kept his papers, all of them. And Goodwin had spent 15 years already documenting and cross-referencing decades of his prodigious jottings. She'd been through every letter, every daily account book, every garden plotting, every receipt, every architectural rendering, his bank statements, his French customs forms, and his doodles, and none had ever indicated that he had bought the wines that were now being sold overseas as once being in his hidden treasure. By the way, there was an inside joke at Monticello about Jefferson's obsessive record keeping. He never had use for a wastebasket. Goodwin had not been hesitant about this conclusion. Her job was to protect the sanctity of Jefferson's life and legacy, so she wrote an academic paper on the matter. She explained that she could not vouch for the authenticity of the wine. That was not her realm of expertise, but she could categorically state that there was no extant evidence that Jefferson had ever owned these bottles. She gave Rodenstock and Broadbent the benefit of the doubt, though. She conceded that someone else who valued good wine could have hidden it from destruction and had those rather common initials. And she asked, once more for emphasis, and where were these bottles found again? And how many? The London Times got wind of Goodwin's concerns and printed them before the auction. But Broadbent had stood firm. He acknowledged he had no proof, but a whole heap of circumstantial evidence in his favor. Besides, he was the one who had convinced Rodenstock to let him sell this bottle. He knew the dealer had already sold one such Jefferson bottle to a German collector named Hans Peter Fredericks, who had paid 10,000 Deutschmarks for it. If Christie's was going to stay on top of the rare wine market, he had to offer it. And he had high hopes that Christie's could better the price already paid for one. The bidding began at £10,000. 2 minutes later, when the bidding ended, Christopher Forbes, son of Malcolm, paid £105,000 sterling, or 157,000 bright green American dollars, to take it home to his father, the prime collector in the family. It was the most expensive bottle of wine ever sold at auction. After the Forbes family bought that bottle of wine for what would translate to nearly $500,000 in today's money, the question in all of the wine world became, can we get our hands on some of that too? Rodenstock said he could, though he was scrupulously guarded about at what address these bottles had been found and by whom. Rodenstock was a rather recent addition to the wine world. He'd been a music producer in Germany and had always loved wine, but was rapidly getting a reputation as the go-to guy for the best of the best. Konstantin Baum, one of the few people in the world who can claim to be a wine master, explained on his YouTube series Wine Scandals that Oddly enough, Rodenstock's appearance on the wine scene also coincided with something else.
Called Hardy Rodenstock became famous for locating the world's rarest wines. He had these exclusive and lavish wine tastings where he opened bottles from the best wineries going back to the 18th century.
Yet Rodenstock demonstrated this strange capacity to procure lost wines of yore from such diverse places as Scotland, Venezuela, and Russia. He had tracked them down. In Russia, he made some odd remarks about them being associated with a Tsar. As for his own origins, he hinted that he was part of the wealthy German Rodenstock family, which had made its mark in optics. He had lived a varied life, he said, as he had been a professor at a university, been a music producer, and dabbled quite successfully in the stock market. It was in the early 1980s when he took to hosting elaborate wine tastings at posh restaurants where he invited celebrities to mingle with the wine connoisseurs for hours while they drank a progression of wines that were aimed to teach as well as charm his guests. One night, a particularly big name showed up to one of Rodenstock's fancy wine tastings, Robert Parker. You might not know his face, but you've definitely seen his influence. He's the guy behind the Wine Advocate newsletter and the reason your $18 bottle of Cabernet brags about scoring a 92. Parker basically invented the 100-point wine rating system, which helped both wine snobs and average drinkers figure out what was worth their money. At this particular event, Parker found the whole thing impressive, sure, but he wasn't exactly interested. These were ultra-rare, ultra-expensive bottles, and not the kind of thing your average consumer could ever dream of buying. Still, Parker knew, just like Rodenstock knew, that there were people out there who could afford them. And here's where things get tricky. Anyone deep into wine culture knows that wine is different from most collectibles. You can either admire it on a shelf unopened, or you can drink it. And the moment it's gone, it's gone. Drinking one of these bottles is like buying a Monet and deciding to hang it in your kitchen during a spaghetti fight. I mean, once it's consumed, all you've got is the memory, which means the stakes are high. If someone's selling you a so-called masterpiece, you want to be damn sure it's the real deal. So someone has to play expert. Someone has to decide whether this wine is truly what it claims to be. And like art, it's a question of authenticity. Is it all Monet? Or did some other guy dab a few strokes on at the end? Because faking wine is as old as the art of making it. Here's Patrick Radden Keefe, the New Yorker staff writer who penned Jefferson's Bottles in a 2007 issue of the magazine. He's talking here with NPR's Steve Inskeep on Morning Edition.
There are two ways to counterfeit wine. You're either messing with what's in the bottle, or you're messing with the bottle itself.
Without being terribly specific, because as I warned you, I won't get in too over my head here, wine can be adulterated in a variety of ways. The most common is to add water to it, just to make more of it. Sugar, dyes, or fruit juices can be added to increase sweetness, color, and acid. Or someone could simply mix cheaper, lower quality wines into high quality wines to sell the product at a higher price point. These are done by unsealing the wax, uncorking the bottle, mixing at will, and recorking and resealing. Not as easy to spot as you might guess. And here's the hard, cold truth about faux wine. There are so few people on the planet who really know and can taste the difference that the chances of being detected are practically nil. So yeah, it's been going on for a long time. King Louis XIV signed a royal decree that all of the wine barrels coming from the Côte du Rhône area of France had to be stamped with the initials CDR to prove their origin. Now, the counterfeiting could be a lot simpler. Someone could just fill empty high-end bottles with lesser wine. And not surprisingly, the rarer the vintage, the more likely that someone somewhere saw a profit waiting to be had. And that same NPR report referenced a minute ago, Jancis Robinson, writer for the Financial Times, told listeners how changing the exterior appearance is also a familiar tactic for faking wine. Someone could even just fill empty, high-end bottles with lesser wine. Not surprisingly, the rarer the vintage, the more likely that someone somewhere saw a profit waiting to be had. In that same radio report, Jancis Robinson, writer for the Financial Times, told listeners how changing the exterior appearance is also a familiar tactic for faking wine.
Fraudsters put a lot of work into trying to make their corks look distressed. It's important that the label looks as though it's been around the block a bit, and so they might rub it with a bit of earth or coffee grounds.
With all this knowledge, all this history, you'd have thought the wine world would have learned to err on the side of caution. Bizarrely enough, in 1985, the same year that Christie sold their Jefferson Lafite to Christopher Forbes for a record-setting sum, the European wine market had just weathered its worst example of wine fraud. Winemaster Baum explained how this Austrian and German winemaker scandal unfolded in early 1985.
It is easy to forget nowadays that there was a time when producers in Northern Europe really struggled to ripen grapes. Some crafty or rather criminal winemakers came up with the idea of adding diethylene glycol to their wines in order to make them taste sweet without having to go through the arduous process of letting the grapes ripen. Diethylene glycol can also be used as antifreeze, and it can be poisonous if consumed in larger quantities, but for those wineries it was an easy way to increase profits.
The whole thing was revealed to government authorities when one of the producers decided he would claim the antifreeze as a business expense. A sharp-eyed reviewer of legitimate business expenses raised the red flag. The story exploded. It also made an episode of The Simpsons.
Drink this.
Oh, no thanks, sir.
Do not worry. This is France. It is customary for children to take a little wine now and then.
Yeah, but it's got antifreeze in there.
Drink it!
Oh.
Appearing in the New York Times that summer, headlined, "Austria impounds wine laced with poison," Reuters reported that, quote, 5 million bottles of Austrian wine were set to be destroyed after authorities had discovered the chemical used in antifreeze was present in the wine, end quote. That was the first time the Austrian government had told consumers to stop drinking Austrian vintages, even though they had discovered the fraud 3 months earlier. Turns out that the amount contained in a bottle was relatively limited and was not near fatal limits. No one died as a result of ingesting the wine. However, a spokesperson for the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms did say in a later report that, quote, "It is our understanding from the Food and Drug Administration that there is a cumulative effect. It would be difficult to find diethylene glycol in an autopsy unless you knew what you were looking for," end quote. Regardless, the damage was done, at least to the Austrian wine industry, which has spent decades clawing its way back into respectability. Now, you might think that after the Austrian antifreeze scandal made headlines across Europe in 1985, the very same year as the record-breaking Jefferson bottle auction, wine collectors would have learned to be more cautious about questionable bottles. You would be wrong. Damage is relative when people don't want to listen to cautionary tales. Count among them the Middle Eastern businessman who bought a Jefferson bottle from Rodenstock and the Wine Spectator magazine publisher who got his at a Christie's auction. He had been outbid the first time by Forbes. By 1998, you can also count among those who didn't care a whole gaggle of various rich guys who bought 19 of the ballyhooed Jefferson bottles. Count also among them one of the wealthiest men on the planet, Bill Koch. A heads up, we will not be concerning ourselves today with Bill's brothers, Charles and David Koch, who exert an extraordinary amount of financial influence on American politics. They tend to be very busy these days. Now, back in 1983, Charles and David waged a bitter legal fight with Bill and fourth brother Frederick over the running of their mutually held Koch Industries. Suffice to say that Charles and David bought Bill out, and Bill went on to found his very own energy company, Oxbow Carbon. These days, Bill's net worth is about $2 billion. He doesn't seem to dabble much in politics, but spends his time and money on collecting art and wine. He had 40,000 bottles in his 3 wine cellars. They aren't your average basements. Here's Koch taking Sotheby's on a tour of one of his vast accumulations of rare, expensive, and climate-sensitive treasures.
Wanted the cellar to look like it was an old European cellar, so we put some Roman mosaics, which are up there. And we found this group in Austria that came over with 10 men, only one could speak English, and they brought all these bricks with them, and they just did a sketch and put all these arches and things in. And if you come down here, see what we do is we put the standard bottles in racks, and then we have the bigger ones hanging out. Those bottles, you see how big they are? Those are Nebuchadnezzar, and they hold the equivalent of 20 bottles. It takes 3 men to pour it.
He liked to show his treasures off to his friends. Among them were 4 bottles from the Jefferson stash, acquired in late 1988. All told, he spent about $500,000 on the 4, back in the 80s. In Benjamin Wallace's book, The Billionaire's Vinegar, the billionaire is Bill Koch. That's because, in 2005, Koch, who was a benefactor and trustee of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, was approached by the institution in hopes of showing the public his collected wonders. The exhibit was set to be entitled Things I Love. Koch was delighted. The MFA was apparently more diligent in its quest for provenance than Christie's Broadbent had been. They thought the Jefferson bottles would truly bring in the crowds, and thus sought out experts who would add to the historical background. Broadbent obliged, giving his official nod to their quality and their provenance. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello, again, declined to endorse the story. Said senior curator and historian Susan Stein, quote, "We don't believe those bottles ever belonged to Thomas Jefferson," end quote. Reiterating the point, Lucia Stanton, senior historian at Monticello for over 30 years, told NPR that
in his vast records, over 60,000 documents, there was nothing that suggested that Jefferson had ever ordered any of these wines. There were about a dozen bottles, 1784 and 87, Chateau d'Yquem, 1787 Lafitte, Amargo. Most of them were 1787s, which is a vintage Jefferson never ordered in his life.
Koch was outraged, but not by the MFA's diligence or by Jefferson's people. He wanted answers. Then he did what billionaires do. He threw a lot of money at finding them. If he found that he had been defrauded, this former Midwestern farm boy wanted not only to sue whoever had done it, but he wanted those responsible to pay a criminal price for doing so. He wanted them to pay for taking him for a bozo. And yes, he suspected Rodenstock. First, Koch hired a former FBI agent named Jim Elroy, who had specialized in fraud cases his entire career. Elroy knew what evidence was, and he knew that if he was going to prove fraud, he was going to have to deconstruct the bottles they came in, the engraving that was on those bottles, and, if possible, whatever was inside of them. Then he would know. And if Koch had been screwed, soon everyone would know. Truth was, a lot of people in the wine world already suspected Rodenstock was full of it. A few years earlier, the Wine Spectator had run a humorous piece of faux news that parodied his uncommon power to find the unfindable. Here's French podcaster Pommier reading from the magazine.
$5.7 million bid for a red wine believed to have belonged to Julius Caesar. The ancient clay amphora which bears the initials JC, was found in a bombed-out cellar in Beirut, Lebanon, by well-known West German collector Hardy Rodenstock. Michael Broadbent has verified the amphora as genuine and stated that it may well be drinkable. Only last year, I tried a 2,000-year-old wine from Crete, and although the color was somewhat faded and the flavors had dried out, it still retained a delicate bouquet of pine resin, ancient Roman sandals, and Minoan bull droppings.
The pointed barb hit its target, making Rodenstock react with a flurry of letters trying to discredit the entire staff of the magazine. It was his habit from early on. Remember when Cinder Goodwin had tried applying real scholarship to the Jefferson find? Well, Rodenstock had sent her and her boss this little missive. Quote, "One should courteously keep back one's dubious and unfounded remarks, and one shouldn't make oneself important in front of the press." End quote. Monticello's executive director, Dan Jordan, wrote back that the foundation had no financial interest in determining whether the bottles were authentic or not. Rather, he wrote, they were just stating facts. But this was Rodenstock's M.O. Anyone who questioned him was mercilessly hounded to retract their opinions. Sounds familiar. But his outward showing public face was taking its own beating. Blame his penchant for unrestrained, self-indulgent excess.
The events organized by Rodenstock and his friends become each time more decadent. Like this private party hosted at the State Museum of Egyptian Art in Munich, where a table with silver plates and nearly 2 kilos of caviar has been installed amongst the mummies and statues of ancient Egypt. So decadent, in fact, that a small protest starts outside the building against this private use of government property.
Rodenstock had shown he knew how to spend money. But other people had money too, and Bill Koch was about to prove that when a billionaire feels he's been made a fool, he doesn't just write angry letters. He hires investigators. Let's go back to the first Jefferson bottle that Rodenstock let out of his possession. That one went, if you recall, to Hans Peter Fredericks. In 1990, he decided to have the bottle, its label, its contents, liquid and sediment, tested for age. This was prompted by an overture he'd made to Sotheby's to auction off his entire cellar. After their experts had reviewed its contents, they declined his offer. Why, he asked. Because it contained so many likely fakes. Hence the desire to get to the bottom of this. He would open and test one of his Rodenstock bottles, the 1787 Lafitte. Now, this was not as easy as it sounds. This required a massive amount of scientific expertise and equipment, with protons being fired down multiple room-sized barrels, with wavelengths of emitting energy being measured, and a crowd of people with doctorates comparing results. But a lot of it boiled down to this. If the wine contained a lot of tritium, it likely wasn't old. Tritium is a rare and radioactive isotope of hydrogen that has a half-life of only 12.32 years. It is extremely rare on Earth. The sediment in the bottle contained no tritium, but the wine itself had a lot. By doing math that no ordinary human can do, physicists determined the drinkable stuff was likely produced after 1962.
Curiously, this breaking news will barely appear in the German press, let alone the international media, and the judgment will have no impact on his reputation.
Nevertheless, Rodenstock went on the warpath. He appealed the ruling. He said someone had fiddled with his wine. He said the science was flawed. He said he'd have follow-up tests done by a German-based scientist who specialized in carbon dating. Once those were done, he proudly announced they redeemed him. Well, not exactly. It had only, in fact, ruled out the presence of late 20th century wine. Then, just like that, the word came that Fredericks and Rodenstock had settled the case, and the documents associated with it were sealed by the German courts. And it was all very confusing. Critics kept saying if he would just tell them where he found the bottles and wasn't quite so vague about how many he had, that'd be a start. Rodenstock responded like any third grader might. He said they were just jealous. They hadn't discovered the bottles themselves. The confusion dissipated, apparently, as the availability and price of older and previously unknown vintages and bottle sizes began to surge in the mid-1990s. Even vineyards who had produced the wine were saying they had not bottled certain wines in magnums or Jeroboams. These, by the way, are sizes of containers. A magnum contains the amount held by 2 standard bottles. A Jeroboam contains 4. Robert Parker, everyone's favorite wine rater, bemoaned in a published essay that, quote, rare wine may be the only luxury price commodity in the world that does not come with a guarantee of authenticity, end quote. The proliferation of frauds was so concerning that a group of New York wine dealers held a secret meeting to see what they could do to stem the tide. They knew they were swimming in fakes, but couldn't find a way out. You sold what came to you. You hedged your bets. Then a reporter from Wine Spectator got the scoop of his life.
And in the mid-1990s, Wine Spectator journalist James Suckling publishes the interview of a German sommelier who anonymously explains that he has recipes for Petrus 61, Cheval Blanc 47, or Mouton 45.
Bill Koch had kept up with the news in the wine world. He had his own nagging concerns about his 4 Jefferson bottles before the MFA show, but if he'd been shown to have overpaid for bogus wine, he hardly expected sympathy. As Arthur Wallace so adeptly put it, his was a rich man's problem, and that made him a soft, fat target for the press. But this was a guy who had felt he'd been badly cheated by his own brothers. He was no fan of cheating. When the Boston MFA decided not to include his Jefferson bottles in the Things I Love show, that was the last straw. Koch told the New Yorker's Patrick Radden Keefe, quote, I bought so much art, so many guns, so many other things, that if somebody's out to cheat me, I want the son of a bitch to pay for it, end quote. So it was that Jim Elroy, Koch's FBI-trained investigator, set out to make someone pay. Jim Elroy began tracing the wine's provenance, and after talking to the folks at Monticello and the various firms who had bought or handled the bottles over the years, the Rodenstock story sprang the usual leaks. Undeterred, Elroy and his team, they included a former Scotland Yard inspector and a former MI5 agent in Germany, as well as a raft of international wine experts, decided to look into Rodenstock. The team found that Rodenstock did not belong to the moneyed German family, as he had implied. His real name, in fact, was Meinhard Gurke, and his family had worked for the local railroad in West Prussia. He had worked in the German music industry, but none of the investigations turned up employment at any university when he might have been what he termed a professor. But wine, when he happened upon it as a career choice, was tailor-made for him. He had what many considered a remarkable ability to identify wines in blind tastings and could smell flavors and taste notes in wines as if he had been born into it. Somehow, Elroy was able to access the unsealed records in the earlier Fredericks case and found that a German court had determined that Rodenstock, quote, adulterated the wine or knowingly offered adulterated wine for sale, end quote. Now they were getting somewhere. Here's a small excerpt from Patrick Radden Keefe's New Yorker piece from 2007. Quote, Elroy wondered whether he, Rodenstock, might possess the skills of a mixer, the type of expert that vineyards employ to achieve a precise blend of grapes. There are no scientific tests that can reliably determine the grape varietals in a bottle of wine, and Elroy speculated that Rodenstock might have concocted forgeries by mixing various wines, and even a dash of port, as forgers have been known to do, in order to create a cocktail that tasted like the real thing, end quote. Elroy and his team fanned out to find Rodenstock's factory, but came up dry. Elroy then decided to again go the science route, which had made some significant advances in this arena in the intervening decade. He found Philippe Hubert, a French physicist working at the University of Bordeaux. Here's Hubert speaking to NPR in 2014.
I take the bottle in the hand, I put the bottle close to the detector, then I close the shielding, and we start to record the gamma rays we are looking for, radioactivity in the wine.
Hubert went on to explain that since Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Cold War's repeated atmospheric tests, and the Chernobyl nuclear reactor meltdown in 1986,
this radioactivity, it's everywhere. Then with the rain, this radioactivity pours on the grapes. When you make the wine, this comes into the wine and stays into the wine. If I see cesium in a bottle of, let's say, 1900, it is sure that it is a fake.
That's because cesium-137 does not exist in nature. It's a byproduct of nuclear reaction and could not have existed before the first nuclear reaction took place in the New Mexico desert in July 1945. Did Hubert find cesium in Koch's bottles? No. He ran more sophisticated tests, and they too were inconclusive, only proving, because of the isotope's half-life, that it dated to before 1943. Carbon dating would only place the age of the wine between 1750 and 1950. Rodenstock gloated on hearing the news, adding that he wished Koch was drinking the wine instead of toting it around the world to test it. He said, quote, "Alone the thought that Jefferson and Washington have also drunk these wines makes you have a minute of silence when drinking these wines. You just drank history," end quote. Koch was playing the long game. In January 2006, he wrote Rodenstock a naive enough sounding letter asking him to send along his assurance that the bottles once belonged to Jefferson. Rodenstock promptly replied. He wrote these words, quote, "The Jefferson bottles are absolutely genuine and come from a walled-up cellar in Paris," end quote. This would play well in court if it ever came to that. Surely, Koch thought, it would definitely come to that. Elroy, deflated over the news about the cesium tests, still operated on a lot of experienced instinct. The story goes that as he was flying back to the United States after picking up the bottle that had been tested by Hubert, he ran his hand over the engraving and inspected the dark green glass that held the precious liquid. As he would later say, quote, "And then I think, this is a tool mark," end quote. He would set out now to find the tool, and if it had existed in 1787. When the plane landed, Elroy went straight to Quantico. He found the FBI's best ballistics experts, those who look at marks in gun barrels and on safes and whatever had been pried open with a sharp object to commit a crime, and asked them to evaluate the marks. He also asked the FBI to suggest some people who might be able to date the glass. The tool mark people found an 18th century copper wheel, the kind of thing that would have been used in Jefferson's day to engrave glass. Try as they might, they could not replicate the results. The angle was wrong, the precision unattainable. The quality of their engravings with the foot-pedal-operated wheel was woefully lacking compared to that which Thomas Jefferson was supposed to have whipped out with relative ease. The FBI is not the FBI for nothing. They tried various ways to replicate the inscription and concluded the engravings on the bottle were made with either a modern dentist drill or a Dremel hand tool you can buy at Home Depot. The glass expert, they found him at the Corning Museum in Corning, New York, concurred. The copper wheel could not have sufficiently done the work on the glass. At the end of the summer of 2006, Bill Koch filed suit against Rodenstock for his ongoing scheme of defrauding those who purchase wine based upon his lies. The complaint called Rodenstock a con man. Bill Koch had spent more than $1 million in his quest to hunt down the truth. He also hired a Sotheby's wine expert to evaluate his cellar for any other bottles of wine that weren't what their labels said they were. The list included several more bottles that Koch had bought through Rodenstock. Hearing this, a concerned Michael Broadbent, now aged and on the auction house's board, asked to have Christie's look anew at the bottles. They found them absolutely correct for the time and place in which they supposedly were bottled. In other words, no red flags. Meanwhile, the German press reported on the filing of the Koch lawsuit, and somehow a man named Andreas Klein finally came to learn how an old tenant of his was now being accused of forging wine. Klein had rented an apartment to Hardy Rodenstock in Germany a few years before. They'd eventually become combative about the terms. They disagreed about the rent, a mold issue, and too much noise, and took each other to court to settle their differences. Klein had a chance during that process to enter the apartment and its cellar. There, he had seen stacks of empty bottles and a score of new wine labels. Finding not much satisfaction with the courts, Klein had informed the German tax authorities of Rodenstock's work in Munich during a time in which the wine connoisseur had not paid German taxes. He was more than happy to call Bill Koch and tell him what he knew. As you might expect, Rodenstock hardly acknowledged the lawsuit. He claimed that the United States had no jurisdiction, as he was a German citizen. He also said that, in any case, the statute of limitations on such an action had passed. He blamed everyone else for his troubles, including journalists, though he went out of his way to present them with evidence of his innocence. He continued to hobnob among the wine set in Europe, but never ventured back to the United States. A default judgment was entered against Rodenstock in May 2010, giving Koch a symbolic win, but no real satisfaction. When the Benjamin Wallace book came out, Broadbent sued Random House for defamation for reporting that his relationship with Rodenstock had been improper. Random House, yielding to the more lenient defamation laws in that country, apologized and suspended publication of the book in the United Kingdom. Notably, Wallace was not sued. The publisher was not required to make any changes to the text. But the wine world, in theory, grew more cautious at first, calling the whole affair cathartic and necessary. But their memories proved remarkably short. In the early 2000s, Rudy Kurniawan was the owner of a magnificent wine cellar and consigned much of it to Christie's in Los Angeles for resale. It was said he spent $1 million a month on wine in order to build his envied hoard. Things began to fall apart when it was discovered that he had sold more magnums of 1947 Chateau Lafleur than had been produced, and that he had sold a 1923 vintage from a vineyard that did not produce wine until 1924. In 2014, Rudy Kurniawan became the first person to be tried and convicted in a U.S. federal court for counterfeiting wine. He received a 10-year prison sentence, something that shocked him and his attorneys, and was ordered to pay $28.4 million in restitution to those he had defrauded. He was also forced to forfeit $20 million in personal property. That property included his own cellar full of fake wine. Those bottles, with their fake labels and fake corks and fake stamps, sold for tens of thousands per, according to Wine Spectator. The biggest surprise of that trial was how few showed up to say they had been defrauded, even though U.S. District Judge Richard Berman had repeatedly asked the defendant to name them and tell the court exactly how many had been taken in by his ruse. Seems that not everyone wanted it to be known how easily they could be fooled. The judge, instructing the jury, told them they were not to consider whether those who had been Korniawan's victims could afford the loss. Rich or poor, the judge said, you're entitled to get what you paid for. Korniawan was released from prison in late 2020 and then deported to Indonesia. Hardy Rodenstock died in 2018, never admitting to any wrongdoing, never saying where his most famous bottles had been found or how. And remember that German sommelier who had told the Wine Spectator reporter he had recipes for those really rare wines? He went public. He was Hardy Rodenstock's private wine guy. Monticello had no comment. Now, usually our crimes of the centuries result in some kind of change. I can't exactly say that about this case.
These incidents did not really have a very strong impact on the fine wine market as a whole, and I really wish that producers and retailers work together in order to combat fraud and counterfeiting.
The market for impossibly expensive wines has by no means diminished. In fact, in 2018, a bottle of a 1945 French Burgundy sold for $558,000 at Sotheby's. For anyone interested, that's about $40 per drop.